I want to get to Senator Nelson, who's down in Orlando this morning, a senator from Florida and a former astronaut. Senator,
Bill.
you're hearing what Senator Sessions is talking about on cutting spending, but I got to ask you, it seems to me like that Speaker Pelosi pretty much laid down the law about how Democrats feel about making any changes in Social Security and the entitlement programs. And a lot of people say unless you get into that, there's no way you can get a realistic deal. How do you feel? Would you vote for a plan if they said we're going to have to reduce Social Security benefits or any of these entitlements?
Well, Bob asked the question first, how did we get into this problem of the big deficit? And it's basically a fall off of revenues and an increase in spending. So you got to correct that imbalance. Otherwise, you're not doing real deficit reduction. And we've got to hit something like $4 trillion in deficit reduction over the next 10 years. And I'm coming to your question in just a second, but I want to lay the predicate. There are lots of ways to get additional revenue by eliminating some of these tax preferences for special interests called tax loopholes. And I want to make an offer to Jeffrey, who is my dear friend, that if you took the money that the federal government would save from all of those tax loopholes and instead use that to lower all of the tax levels of the different tax brackets, what you'd have is a revenue neutral position, but because you would simplify the tax code, you would end up raising more revenue because it would spur up the engine of economic growth. And now to your question about Social Security. Bob, you don't have to touch Social Security to do what I just said, and even if you touch Social Security, that's not going to help in this next decade to get the deficit reduction that we need.
Well, quickly, Senator, what's your response?
Well, that's a great position, and I would support that. But that's not what the Democratic Senate budget that has been revealed partially to us does. It increases taxes by reducing these loopholes and increases other taxes and actually spends the money rather than using it to reduce rates. That's not acceptable. And what's happened is this government has surged spending. The numbers of 24% increase in spending do not include the stimulus package of almost $1 trillion. Right. And so they want to now demand the American people pay more money to fund these increasingly high rates of spending, and that's the big difference. American people expect us to bring this spending down to reasonable levels before they're asked to pay more taxes.
Jeffrey, I just want to say this, Bob. Jeffrey, you've got to acknowledge that part of our deficit problem was the huge Bush tax cuts in the early part of the decade. That accounted by what was handed off to the new administration of over $1 trillion of annual deficit. That accounted for almost half of it. So if you're going to be real about the numbers, you're going to have to address these kind of things.
Well, that's not accurate, Bill. The revenue went up every single year after those tax cuts were put in. The revenue is down now because of the low economy. You're right about that, and I would agree. So the question is, well, it's not because taxes have been cut in recent years, it's because people are not making money and they're not paying as much taxes. So increasing taxes on that weakened economy is not the way to increase revenue at this time, which I thought we agreed on last December.
Senator, Senator Nelson.
Jeffrey, I didn't say raise the taxes. I said eliminate some of those tax giveaways that aren't doing anything. And there's a bunch of cash out there that's stashed overseas that ought to be taxed as income because it's an American income. You do a combination of those things and you can do some real changes here.
Well, if you used it to lower rates, I'm all with you. If you use it, as the President suggests, for more spending, I'm against it.
All right, gentlemen, I'm very sorry the clock's run out here. We have to end the discussion here. Senator Nelson, sorry I didn't get to ask you about the space program because you're a former astronaut, but we ran out of time. We'll be back in a moment with some final thoughts.